She came to return a stray that wandered onto her land. His entire missing string was walking behind it. The sorrel mare was the one I'd been looking for 11 days. I knew her the moment I saw her through the window glass, the white blaze that ran crooked, a little left of center like somebody had started painting and changed their mind partway through. I'd had her mother. I'd had her grandmother before that. You know a line of horses the way you know a line of people. Something in the ears, something in how they carry their neck when they're at rest and nothing's threatening them. I'd have known her in the dark, in the middle of a herd of 50. She had her grandmother's way of holding her head a little proud, like she was aware of herself, aware of taking up space in the world and not apologizing for it. I'd always liked that quality in a horse. I like it in people too, though I've been slower about learning to recognize it. She was standing in my yard, and my daughter was holding her lead rope. I hadn't seen Cora in 4 years. She didn't look like she was planning to stay. She had her coat buttoned to the collar, a man's heavy canvas work coat, dark brown, the kind you buy to work in rather than to be seen in, and her jaw set the way her mother used to set hers when a conversation was already decided in her head, and she was just waiting for the other person to reach the same conclusion. Patient, but not warm about it. She tied her own horse to the gate post, a big red roan I didn't recognize, a good-looking animal, well put together, the kind of horse a person buys when they know what they're looking at, and she was standing in the cold morning with the sorrel at her hip like she was making a delivery. Come to drop something off and get back to her own life. I stood at the window a moment longer than I needed to. Longer than was entirely comfortable, if I'm being straight about it. Partly, I needed to settle something in myself before I went out there. And partly, I'm not going to pretend this wasn't true, I just wanted to look at her one extra second without her knowing I was doing it. She was 41 years old. I'd carried that number the way you carry your own age, always aware of it without thinking about it directly. Her birthday was a date I'd never lost, not through any of the years I wasn't there for it. Cora Ann. She'd had her mother's name for a middle name, and I'd chosen the first name without asking whether me liked it, which was typical of me at that time in my life, going ahead with what I'd decided without checking whether the other person had a say. Me hadn't said anything about the name. She just looked at the baby and said she supposed it fit. Later, I understood that was generosity, not agreement. Me was full of those quiet generosities that I'd failed to recognize as such while I was receiving them. She looked like her mother around the eyes and the brow. Me had had those particular eyes, a light hazel that went almost green in certain light, set in a face that was sharp and clear, and told you exactly what she was thinking whether she meant it to or not. Cora had that, but she had my jaw and my way of standing, weight a little forward, watching, the stance of someone who expects things to require a response. I noticed she'd lost a little weight since I'd last seen her, or maybe she'd just gotten leaner, the way a person does when they're working hard and living simply. 4 years on a ranch alone after Garrett died would do that. Garrett had been gone 2 years now. I'd gone to the funeral. Cora had shaken my hand at the reception with the careful politeness of a woman performing something she decided she needed to do. We hadn't spoken more than a few words. I'd driven home in the evening and sat in the kitchen for a while and thought about what it cost her to shake my hand that day, and what it had cost her to let me be there at all, and I hadn't come up with satisfying answers to either question. I went outside without a hat. I remember the cold on the top of my head. That specific cold of November mornings when the sun's up but hasn't done anything yet, bright and cold and clear, and offering nothing in the way of warmth. She said, "Found her in my south pasture, your brand." She didn't say my name. She hadn't called me anything in years, not Pop, not Father, not even the name my own mother gave me. To Cora, I was a kind of complicated fact that occasionally demanded attention. A man at the end of a lead rope who needed his horse returned. I said, "Thank you for bringing her." She handed me the rope. Her fingers were red from the cold, and her knuckles had those deep cracks in them that come from working outside in dry November air. She hadn't worn gloves for the ride, or she'd taken them off before she came through the gate. For some reason I didn't fully understand, or maybe didn't need to. She looked past me at the empty corral. The 11 missing horses had left a particular kind of silence behind them. You don't realize how much sound a corral full of horses makes until it isn't making it anymore. The weight of all that quiet, just fence posts and bare hard dirt and the water trough nobody was drinking from, and the feeder with hay sitting in it going to waste. I'd stopped topping off the hay 3 days ago because it felt like a kind of lying, pretending the animals were coming back to eat it tonight. But I hadn't been able to bring myself to stop filling the water trough. Some things you can't stop doing. She said, "Where's the rest of them?" I told her. Gate latch failed on me. Old iron hardware I'd been meaning to replace for 2 seasons and hadn't gotten to. The way a man alone on a place doesn't get to certain things because there's always something louder demanding attention first. A storm had come through and pushed the gate open, and by the time I realized what had happened, around 4 in the morning when the sound of the wind changed and woke me and I went to check, they were already gone. 11 horses scattered into the dark and the cold and the canyon country to the north. I'd been out every day since, sometimes twice. Long days in the cold, moving through the country in widening passes, reading the ground for tracks and coming up with partial trails that went cold in rocky terrain or got scrambled by the freeze-thaw cycles that had been alternating all week. I'd found places they'd grazed, places 2 or 3 of them had sheltered against a cutbank overnight. Once I'd found a spot where the whole group had bedded, the ground still showing the long pressed shapes of them, the frosted grass crushed flat in a rough circle. But never the animals themselves. Like they'd made a collective decision to simply not be findable, which horses will do sometimes when the country is in their favor. Cora looked at the empty corral for a long moment. She was running the calculation. I could see it in how still she went. 11 head in November, canyon country to the north of my place, cold going deeper every night. She knew what that meant. She'd grown up around horses and she'd spent 20 years on this range with a man who knew it well, and whatever the years had done to the space between us, they hadn't done anything to the part of her that could look at a situation and assess it accurately. She said, "When did you last have eyes on them?" I said 11 days. She was quiet, a long quiet. Cora had always made her decisions this way. She went still, went internal, and when she came back out she had the answer already settled and she wasn't going to revisit it unless you gave her a very good reason to. She'd gotten that from me. Me had been the same. I made decisions loud and fast and I was right about half the time. These 2 women had made decisions slowly and quietly, and they were right considerably more than that. She said, "I know where they might be. There's a canyon cut into the Red Mesa about 14 miles northeast of my place. I'd known about it for years in the abstract, the old way you know pieces of country you've passed through but not worked closely. Cora's late husband had worked that range for 2 decades. A man named Garrett Hobbs, quiet and capable and steady, who I'd met a handful of times and liked more than I expected to like him, which may have been because I expected not to like anyone Cora had chosen, given what she knew about men from the example I'd set. Garrett had a name for this particular canyon. He'd called it the Canyon of Lost Things, not with any ceremony, just what he called it, the way men name landmarks when they work a piece of country long enough to need names for things. Cora had put it in a letter once. One of the letters I'd read and not written back to the way I should have, back in the years when writing back properly was apparently beyond me. She didn't know if I'd remembered her telling me. I didn't tell her I had. We rode out together without much discussion. There was a shape to working alongside Cora that felt almost old, the kind of old you feel in a habit your muscles remember even when your mind has let it go. When she was small, on the rare occasions I was present for anything, we got to the practical work first and talked around the edges of other things while we were doing it. It was the way I knew how to be with her, the only channel that was ever fully open. This felt like that. The horses were in trouble, and that was the work, and everything else, years of it, all the heavy, quiet mass of everything else, was just going to have to ride in the saddlebags and wait. She took the roan and I took my buckskin. He was a 10-year-old gelding, big-footed and honest, not much to look at but genuinely good. I'd had him since he was a yearling, and he'd never given me a single reason to be unhappy with him, which in my experience is the best thing you can say about a horse or a person. The sorrel I left in the corral. She'd been out 11 days. She didn't need more miles. The morning was clear and absolutely cold. The kind of cold that comes after a clear night has pulled all the warmth straight up out of the ground and into a sky that keeps none of it. The earth was iron-hard under our horses' feet, and they rang against it, each footfall sharp and clean, the sound carrying out across the open ground further than it would in other weather. I could see our breath and the horse's breath. I could see the frozen grass on the north-facing slopes, white with rime, and the south-facing slopes bare and brown. Cora rode a little to my left and slightly behind, not far. She watched the country. I watched the country. Occasionally one of us would point at something, a disturbance in the frozen soil, a line of tracks along a wash, a place where something had stood for a while and pressed the grass flat, and the other would look and nod. We didn't need words for that part. The land was talking and we were both listening, and we'd always had that in common, the ability to be quiet and pay attention to what was in front of us. Whatever I'd failed to give her over the years, I'd given her that. Or she'd developed it herself and I was taking credit I hadn't earned. I wasn't sure which, probably some of both. I'd been a scout most of my working life. Army work first, when I was young and still believed the work was a means to something rather than a life in itself. Then private work, guiding men into country they didn't know, finding things and people that had gone missing, reading sign for those who couldn't read it for themselves. I'd been good at it. Not just competent, genuinely good. The way a man is good at something when the thing he's doing matches the shape of how his mind works. I'd never been able to explain to anyone exactly what I was doing when I read ground. It wasn't conscious analysis. You looked and you knew. The way you know the meaning of a word without being able to explain the grammar of why it means what it means. I wasn't as fast as I'd been. My right knee had been giving me real trouble since a fall 2 winters back. The buckskin had slipped crossing an iced-over creek, gone down sideways, and my leg got caught between him and the ground in a way that something in the joint had never forgiven. Nothing broke. Nothing required a doctor. It just shifted and didn't shift back, and I felt it now in the cold with a steady low ache that I'd learned to work around the way you work around something that isn't going to improve. I was 63 years old. The knee wasn't going to get better. I'd accepted that the way you accept the arithmetic of your own body when you've been paying attention to it long enough. But the eye still worked. The thing in me that read ground, that picked a horse's passage from the 100 other stories, a piece of country was telling at the same time, that held a line across open terrain without losing it, that noticed what was wrong in a landscape before my conscious mind had caught up with what I was noticing. That thing was still intact, still clean. Some things live in the body and some things live somewhere else, and the things that live somewhere else don't age at the same rate. Cora saw me slow riding a stretch of ground, reading a confusion of tracks where a dry stream bed crossed our path. She didn't say anything. She pulled up her roan and gave me room and let me work. I'd read that particular patch of ground for about 3 minutes. A lot of traffic had come through, deer, a coyote, what looked like a mule deer doe and 2 half-grown fawns moving south. And underneath all of that, 3 days old or more, laid down before the last hard freeze and then pressed into permanence by the cold, the round, clean press of a shod horse. Then another, then a third, going northeast. I put my hand down and felt the edge of one impression without touching the bottom of it, and looked at the angle of the stride, and I was almost certain it was the bay gelding and 2 others moving together. I told her what I was reading. She leaned forward and looked where I pointed. She didn't say she could see it. She looked for a long moment and then she said, 3 days ago, and I said, at least. She nodded. That was all. We moved on. That exchange had a quality I hadn't felt in a long time. The quality of being understood in your work by someone who knew enough to understand it. Most people I showed tracking to the occasional client, people who hired me to find things, they looked and they saw what I was pointing at and they took my word for what it meant. They didn't read it themselves. Cora had looked and read what she could read, which was the timing, the fact of the tracks, the direction. She'd stopped where her knowledge stopped and hadn't pretended beyond it. That was worth something. I thought about her as a girl, how she'd followed me around on the few visits that had happened when she was small enough to follow. She'd been quiet then too, a watcher. She'd had me's quality of full attention. When she was interested in something, she was completely interested in it. No part of her somewhere else. I'd been so often somewhere else in those years that I'd barely been present to notice her noticing things. That was one of the many specific losses I'd made for myself. That was a small thing that mattered more than it should have. We found the first two about 3 miles in. A bay gelding I'd had 6 years, dull and reliable and absolutely trustworthy in rough country. Exactly the kind of horse a man who works alone values most. And the young gray I'd bought the previous spring off a man in town who'd bought more horse than he was ready for. I'd seen the gray in the man's yard looking unhappy about his situation, and I'd bought him for a fair price and spent the summer getting him right. He had a good mind. He just needed someone to take the time. They were standing together in the lee of a long rock outcrop that ran east to west and knocked the north wind. Heads down, standing close for warmth, looking tired and sorry for themselves, which was reasonable. 11 days in the cold with nobody checking on them. The bay had lost weight, you could see at the ribs. The gray had a cut on his near foreleg, not deep, maybe 3 inches long, not into anything structural, but it had been sitting open in the cold for days and it needed attention. I got down slow, the knee. I put weight on it carefully, got my feet flat on the frozen ground, straightened. I'd learned not to let the process look worse than it was. There was no dignity in making a production of it. Cora was already off her horse and moving toward the gray before I'd fully straightened. She went to his head first, let him smell her hand, ran her fingers up his neck in the slow, deliberate way that tells an animal this person knows what they're doing. Then she worked down his leg with the same deliberate hands. She lifted the foot and looked at the cut closely. She looked at it for a while without speaking. Her face was still and professional. She wasn't alarmed, which told me what I needed to know. She said, "Clean it tonight when you get him home. Keep it dry. It's been sitting open long enough that you want to make sure nothing's working in there, but it's not deep. You'll know in 2 or 3 days if it's going to give you trouble." I said I knew. She looked at me quickly, a short look checking had I meant it short. I hadn't meant it short, I just meant it. I knew how to manage a cut on a horse. I'd been doing it since before she was born, but I understood why she looked because I hadn't always been reliable in my communications and she'd learned to check. She seemed to take the right reading from it. She nodded and turned back to the gray. We put lead ropes on both horses and moved north. The country changed as we went further into the mesa country. The open grassland gave way to scrub cedar, and then to the broken terrain at the mesa's base, red sandstone outcrops, dry washes cutting the soil, places where the ground went from hard earth to bare rock without much transition. In summer, this country had a kind of aggressive beauty. In November, it was stark. The color had gone out of everything except the rock itself, which kept its deep orange red regardless of season. Cora was navigating from memory. She didn't consult anything, not the horizon, not landmarks I could see her deliberately noting. She just rode, and the line she rode was purposeful and direct, and I followed her without asking whether she was sure. You can tell when a person knows where they're going, something in how they move. Garrett had known this country for 20 years. Cora had ridden it with him for 13 of those years. Whatever she'd learned in that time was still in her. The way things stay in a person who paid real attention while they were learning. I thought about that as we rode, about how much of who a person becomes is made from the people they've stood next to long enough. Garrett had stood next to her long enough. I hadn't. She could have been bitter about that. She'd had every right to be bitter about that her whole life, and from what I could tell she had been for a long time. I wasn't going to argue with it. The canyon entrance was a narrow slot in the mesa wall, 15 feet wide at most, cut at an angle into the rock so that you couldn't see it from the south until you were within 20 feet. The walls were smooth and high, and they came close together overhead so that inside the slot you were in deep shadow even at midday. Cora went through without hesitating. I followed with the bay and gray on lead ropes, going single file, and then the slot opened out and we were inside. A sheltered bowl maybe 200 yards across, cedar on the slopes, thin winter grass on the floor, a seep running along the base of the east wall, dark water moving slow, not frozen because the wall caught what little afternoon sun there was and held enough warmth to keep it open. The grass was brown and sparse, but there was enough of it, and there had been enough of it for 11 days, which was why they'd stayed. They were in a loose group near the back of the bowl, in the warmest corner, standing with their heads not as low as the first two. Better fed, better sheltered. They heard us and looked up with their ears forward, alert but not alarmed. A couple of the older ones recognized my buckskin and dropped their heads again. The yearling colt I'd bought at the fall auction, who had given me more trouble per pound than any animal I'd owned in years, was standing at the edge of the group watching us, with the calculating expression that meant he was deciding how much trouble to make. 9 of them. 9 plus the 2 we had on ropes, plus the sorrel at home in the corral. 12 the whole string, every last one. Cora counted them the way a person with a professional eye counts animals, methodically, touching each one with her gaze, not rushing. When she finished, she looked at me, and her face did something I hadn't seen it do yet that day. Not quite a smile, something beside a smile, something more interior, the release of a tension she'd been carrying since that morning when I'd told her 11 horses were still out, like a not letting go. She said, "You're not missing any." I said, "No." She said, "Good." The same word as before about the gray's leg, but landing differently, with more weight in it. I stood there in the bowl for a moment looking at all 12 of them together. I'd been thinking about them for 11 days, thinking about each one, where they might be, whether they had water, whether the cold was going to take any of them before I got there. You develop a specific relationship with an animal you've been worrying about. You think about it differently than you think about the one safe in front of you. And when you see it again, alive and standing and looking at you with its ears up, something in your chest releases that you'd been holding tight without knowing it. I walked through the group slowly, the way you do to let them know you're there and you're not a problem, touched shoulders and necks. The bay put his head against my chest for a moment, the way he did when he was cold and wanted the warmth of something. I stood still and let him do it. Cora watched me do this and didn't say anything. Getting 12 horses back through a narrow slot and across 14 miles of frozen country with 2 riders is a job that requires patience more than anything else. You don't push horses through a 15-foot gap in a group. You bring them through in small sets, the steadiest animals first, and you keep your voice quiet and your movements slow, and you let them decide to follow rather than forcing them. Force in a confined space gets animals hurt and gets people hurt along with them. Cora understood this the way I understood it. We worked the horses out of the bowl in sets of 3 and 4, the older ones first, and by the time we had all 12 outside the slot and sorted into a loose string, maybe an hour had passed. A good hour, efficient, quiet, nothing going wrong. Then 14 miles with 2 riders and 12 horses. You watch the whole string constantly. You watch the edges. You watch the young ones because young horses are the ones that get ideas. The yearling colt had a specific kind of look when he was forming an idea, and I'd spent enough time with him since fall to recognize it. The ears went a certain way, the neck elevated a degree or two, and his eyes got a slightly unfocused quality, like he was seeing something that wasn't there. He got that look around mile 3. He drifted to the right, slow at first, then with more intention, the kind of drift that has a destination. He was going to make a break. I could see it in how his hind end started to load, collecting itself for the turn and run. I sat my horse and let Cora go. She'd already seen it. She was already swinging the roan wide, moving at an angle that cut off where the colt wanted to go. She didn't chase him and she didn't threaten him. She just positioned herself quietly without drama and held that position, which took away the direction the colt had been planning to use. He read the situation, dropped his head, and slid back into the string without a fuss. 2 minutes. No noise. Done. I'd have done it the same way. Almost exactly the same way, a little wider maybe, a little more distance, but the same approach. You don't make it into a fight because a fight with a young horse is a fight you can win and still lose. You make yourself the more sensible option, and you let them discover it. She came back to her position on the string. Neither of us said anything about it. But I was aware of something in my chest that I didn't have a plain word for. Not pride exactly. She wasn't mine to be proud of in any way I'd earned the right to claim. Something else. The recognition of competence in a person you've been watching all day. The specific pleasure of working alongside someone who knows what they're doing. The light went amber on the mesa walls around mile 10. That long, low amber of late November afternoons, beautiful in the way things that are about to end are beautiful. The cold had gone from sharp to deep, the kind that settles into your joints and stops asking permission. I felt it in the knee without trying to ignore it anymore. I'd stopped trying to ignore it around mile 7. The ache was just part of the landscape now, like the cold and the rock and the sound of horses on frozen ground. Cora came up alongside me somewhere around mile 9. She rode close, our horses' shoulders nearly touching, which out in open country means you're choosing to be near someone, not just sharing space. She looked ahead at the string and not at me. She said, "You've been out every day for 11 days. It wasn't a question. I said I had. She said, "Alone." I said I didn't have help this time of year. In the summers I sometimes had a young man from town who wanted to learn horses, and I could use an extra set of hands. November wasn't a summer. She rode alongside me for a little while longer without saying anything. The horses moved in front of us, tired and cooperative now, making good time. The lights of my place were still invisible, but I could feel the direction of them, the way you feel the direction of home after you've lived somewhere long enough. Then she said, "I know you do." Said it low, not into the wind exactly, but not loud either, like she'd decided to say it and then said it without performing the saying. "I know you do." I'd had a lot of things said to me over the years. Sympathy-shaped things from people in town who meant well and didn't know what else to say to a man who'd been alone as long as I'd been alone. "You keeping busy, looking well. Good to see you getting out." Things that were kind in their intention and hollow in their effect, because what they were really saying was, "We see you are surviving and we are relieved to not have to worry about you." Nobody had said, "I know you do." Meaning, yes, you manage. You have been managing, and that is a real thing, and I am not going to soften it into something inspirational. I am just going to acknowledge that it is true and that it is not nothing. I didn't say anything back. I watched my horses. After a while she said, "Me used to say you could track a shadow across bare rock." I said, "Your mother was generous." Cora said without pausing, without giving it any air. She didn't waste words. You know that better than anyone. Firm, correcting a factual error. If she said it, she'd thought it, and if she'd thought it, she meant it. That was true. Me had not been a woman who said things because saying them made people feel good. She'd said things because they were true, and if a true thing happened to be a kind thing, that was coincidence, not the motive. She'd told me plenty of true things over the years that weren't kind at all, and I'd needed to hear most of them and hadn't listened to enough of them. And that was a fact I'd made a separate piece within the years since she was gone. I said she was right about most things. Cora said, yeah. Something in the word that was past grief had done its work, and what was left was a kind of settled knowing. She really was. I thought about me then, thought about her directly, which I didn't usually let myself do because I'd found it made the rest of the day harder to get through. But riding next to her daughter in the cold afternoon with 12 horses in front of us, I let myself think about her for a minute. She'd had this same quality Cora was showing, the ability to just work, to assess a situation and respond to what was actually there rather than what she'd expected or hoped. When I was young and we were together, that quality had frustrated me sometimes, because I'd wanted her to be more impressed by me than the situation warranted, and she never was. She saw me plainly. For a long time I thought that was a failure of generosity in her. Later I understood it was the highest kind of regard she could have offered. Cora had it too. She'd been seeing me plainly all day. I didn't know yet what she was seeing. We got the string back to the yard just at last light. The thin blue-black of a November evening, when the color has gone out of everything and the cold is absolute, and the sky in the west has that last stripe of pale orange going dark fast. My breath and the horse's breath made fog. One lamp was burning in the kitchen window. I'd left it lit that morning, the way I always left it when I was planning to come back, which I suppose meant I was always planning to come back, even on the days when I hadn't found anything. Cora helped me sort the horses into the corral, without my asking. She knew which ones to keep apart and which were fine together, which feeder I used for the younger horses and which for the older ones, where the second water trough was, and that I didn't usually use it for the string, but it would be needed tonight with 12 animals to water. She moved through my yard with a quiet competence that told me she'd been here before, not recently, but before, and she'd paid attention when she was here. That was something I stayed with for a moment. She'd paid attention. I started on the gray's leg as soon as the horses were settled. I had a lantern on a hook inside the corral gate, and I got it lit and crouched down slowly, the knee announcing itself, and started working. I've been carrying the supplies for this since that morning, since the moment I first saw his leg at the canyon. Iodine solution in a small jar in my saddlebag, clean cloth folded in my coat pocket. I put them there before we left because I knew we'd be dealing with it at the end of the day, and I didn't want to be scrambling for what I needed when it was dark and cold, and the gray was tired. I heard Cora behind me, heard her cross the yard, heard the pump handle go, heard water running in the pipe. She was filling the trough that needed filling. She'd looked and seen it was low and done it without discussing it. When she came back, I was still working. She crouched down beside me. She'd taken her coat off at some point, working in just her heavy flannel shirt in the cold, which was something her mother had also done, refused to acknowledge cold as an obstacle. And she held the lantern up and a little to the side so I had better light without the shadow of her arm falling across what I was doing. Neither of us said anything. The gray stood patient, young horse but good sense. He understood the difference between pain and discomfort, and he bore the discomfort without drama. I cleaned the wound with the iodine and packed it as clean as I could get it and wrapped it with the cloth. The gray shifted once when the iodine got into something that wanted to react, but he didn't pull away and he didn't make a noise about it. I talked to him quietly while I worked, not words exactly, just sound. The low even murmur that horses understand as "leave it, you're fine, I have this." Cora kept the lantern exactly where I needed it. When I needed it shifted, she shifted it, reading what I was doing and adjusting without my saying anything. When I stood up slow, hand on my knee, she straightened at the same time. She looked at the wrapped leg with a focused, assessing look. She moved the lantern for a better angle on the bandaging. She said, "That's clean." I said, "He'll be all right." She said, "I think so." She reached up and scratched behind the gray's ear, and he leaned into it with the absolute unself-conscious pleasure of an animal who is warm and fed and having an itch addressed. She handed me the lantern, and I hung it back on the hook, and we walked out of the corral together. She didn't leave. I'd had it in my head all day that she would. The shape I'd given the day was, she comes with the horse, we do the work, she goes home. That was the shape of every interaction we'd managed in the last several years. The occasional duty that required contact, the contact made, and then back to separate lives. I'd been bracing myself for the moment of going without even realizing I was doing it. But when I went inside to heat coffee, she came in behind me. She didn't ask and I didn't invite. She just came in and hung her coat on the peg by the door. The peg that had always been hers from visits years earlier, the habit of it apparently still in her, and she came to the table and sat down. The house was the way I kept it. I want to say that plainly because in the years after me and before this place, the houses I'd been in were not this way. In those years I'd let things go in a way that I wasn't proud of and that I'd spent time since being honest about. This house was clean, the table was clear. There was wood stacked inside by the door and coffee in the tin and 2 cups on the shelf that matched. I kept 2 cups. I didn't fully understand why I kept 2. I just did. I set one in front of her and poured, and she wrapped both hands around it, and I could see from across the table how cold her hands still were. The redness in the knuckles, the cracks that hadn't had a chance to heal. She'd been working in the cold for hours, and before that she'd ridden an hour in the cold to bring me 1 horse, and the cup of coffee was the first thing I'd been able to give her. I sat across from her, and we drank without hurrying. The stove made its sounds. The wind moved somewhere at the corner of the house, the way wind does when it finds a gap, a low note under everything. Outside, the horses stood in the corral, all 12 of them accounted for, and the lamp in the window cast its light out into the dark yard and caught nothing in particular. After a while Cora said, "I didn't know you'd gone back to horses." I said I'd started again about 3 years ago. Small operation, trail stock mostly, some working horses, occasionally a young animal I'd gentle for someone else in the summers. 14 head at my most, right now. It kept me in the country I knew, and it was work I was suited for, and at my age I wasn't going to get better suited for anything else. She said, "You were always suited for it." I said, "It suits me." She looked at her cup. She said, 14 miles today in November. You'd have gone out again tomorrow, the day after that." It wasn't quite a question. She'd already figured the answer. I said I would have kept looking until I found them, or until I knew for certain I wasn't going to. She said, "I know," then quieter, "I know you would." She set the cup down. She looked at me with the direct look she had, the one that didn't flinch, and she said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it without you feeling like you have to respond to it immediately. All right." I said, "All right." She said, "I've been angry at you a long time, not just for when I was small, not just for the years when you were gone and I needed a father and you weren't there. I mean, I'm also angry for the years after that when I was grown and the door was open and you kept not walking through it. Letters I wrote that you answered wrong. Visits I made when you seemed like you'd rather be anywhere else. Openings I left and watched you not take. I want you to know I'm not pretending that's gone." I said I knew it wasn't gone. I said she was right about all of it. She said, "But today was something I didn't expect." She stopped, collected something, went on. "Watching you work out there, watching you read that ground the way you read it like it's talking to you in a language nobody else learned. The gray's leg. You'd had that cloth in your pocket since morning." She paused again. "And the colt, when he went sideways, you just sat your horse and let me have it." I started to say something about how she was closer, and the angle was hers. She said, "That wasn't why, and we both know it. Not sharp, just accurate. You knew I had it. You decided to let me have it without needing to put yourself in the middle of it. That's not a thing every man can do." I said she'd handled it clean. She said, "I know I did, but you had to decide to let me." She looked at her cup again, then back up. "Me used to say you were the finest she'd ever seen in hard country. I always thought the way someone talks about a person they loved, softer than the reality, more forgiving of what's actually there. She paused. But today I watched you work all day, and I think she was just telling me a fact. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say to that which wouldn't make it about me, and it wasn't about me, or it wasn't only about me. It was about her, about what she was deciding to see, about the door she was considering opening or not opening. She said, I rode over here this morning to return a neighbor's horse. That's what I told myself. I said I knew. She said, I don't think that was the whole truth of it. I think some part of me already knew, had been knowing, that I was about done being angry, that the anger had done what it needed to do, and now I was just carrying the weight of it without getting anything from it anymore. She looked at the table. A stray horse was a reason that let me come without having to admit I was coming. I said it was a good reason. She almost smiled. The near edge of one, she said, yeah. The stove settled. The wind came around the corner again. She said, I don't know what it looks like, going forward. I don't have a picture of it yet, and I don't want to promise you anything I'm not certain I can deliver, because I've watched enough promises get broken in my life to know that doing it right matters more than doing it fast. I said I understood that. I said I wasn't asking for anything, and I meant it. I hadn't been in a position to ask for anything for a long time, and I'd accepted that. She said, I know you're not. She looked at me. That's part of it, actually. You're not pushing. You haven't pushed in years. I don't entirely know what to make of that, but it's something. I said I'd pushed enough in the wrong times and the wrong ways. I'd learned something from the result. She was quiet for a moment. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind had died down, and the night was still and very cold and very quiet. When the wind stops in November out here, you can hear things from a long distance. A horse moving in the corral, the sound the frozen earth makes when it contracts a little further in the dark. She said, yeah, okay. She looked at her cup and was quiet for a few seconds more. Then she said, Garrett used to say that the thing about this country, the canyon country, the mesa country, is that it doesn't forgive anything. Everything that happens here is recorded. You leave a mark and it stays. I said I'd found that to be true. She said, I think about that sometimes, about what gets recorded and what doesn't. She wrapped her hands around the cup one more time, though it was empty. There's a lot of things from before that I've been keeping a kind of record of. Things that didn't happen that should have. Things that were said and not said. She set the cup down carefully. I'm not finished with that record. I want to be honest about that. But I don't want to be the kind of person who can't look at what's in front of her because she's too busy reading the old marks. I said, that seems right. She said, does it? I said it did, and I meant it more than I usually mean things. She looked at me one more time with that direct look, measuring, and then deciding, and then landing somewhere. And then she nodded, which was the end of that part, and she picked up her cup and finished what was left in it, which was nothing, the cup long since empty, and she set it down and looked at me with that direct, unflinching look. She said, I'll come back in a few weeks, check on the gray. I said, I'll be here. She said, I know. She stood and went to the peg and took her coat and buttoned it back to the collar, the way she'd had it when she came. The same coat, the same woman, but something had shifted in the afternoon, the way ground shifts after a long rain and is subtly different from what it was. I walked her out. The cold was the cold of a November night well set in, serious and total, not the morning's bright sharp cold, but the heavy settled cold that moves in after dark and makes its intentions clear. The stars were out in their full number. Out here away from town, away from the light of anything, you see stars the way people must have always seen them before all the light we've made vast and thick and completely indifferent to whatever is happening down here in the cold. I looked up at them for a second while Cora went to her horse. She untied the roan and checked his cinch. He'd been patient at that gatepost for hours, standing in the cold with his reins looped, and he moved his feet a little when she touched the girth but didn't make a complaint about it. She checked the cinch twice, working carefully the way a careful person always checks twice. Then she turned. She stood there for a moment. I thought she was going to say something practical, something about the gray or the weather or the route home. She didn't. She stepped in close and put her hand on my arm. Just her hand, flat on my coat sleeve, pressing there. Not a hug, not a production of anything, just the placement of a hand on a person to make contact, to press against the reality of them and feel it press back. She stood like that for a second, maybe two. She said, "Don't let that gate latch go again." I said no. She pulled her hand back, swung up onto the roan in one clean motion. She had that still, 41 years old, and she got on a horse the way she always had, without deliberation. She looked down at me once from up there. "Good night," she said. I said, "Good night, Cora." I watched her ride south, watched until the shape of her on the horse was swallowed by the dark, which happened faster than I wanted it to. And then I stood there and listened. You can still hear hoofbeats on frozen ground long after you've lost sight of the rider, the sound carrying clean in the cold air, until there was nothing left to hear. And I stood a little longer than that. Then I went inside. I stood at the stove for a while, both hands toward the heat, letting the warmth work back into my fingers. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. I was letting the day settle, the way you let coffee grounds settle when they've been stirred. The 2 cups were on the table where we'd left them. I washed them both and dried them and put them back on the shelf where they went, side by side. I've told this story to myself many times since that November. I don't know that I've told it to anyone else, or not all of it. There's a version people hear. Daughter found my horses, we brought them home, she stayed for coffee. That's the facts of it. But the facts of it are like the facts of any piece of country. They tell you what's there, but they don't tell you what it means to stand in it. What I know is this. I was a man who had spent most of his life moving, and when the moving finally stopped, I'd ended up here on this small piece of ground, alone in the way a man is alone when the things he walked away from have long since stopped waiting. I'd made a kind of peace with that. A daily peace, renewed each morning, the kind that requires you not to look at certain things too directly or it falls apart. The horses helped. The work helped. Having something to do that required your full attention was the best medication I'd ever found for the particular ailment of being yourself and knowing it. I told myself for years that this was enough, and most mornings I believed it. The sun came up over the mesa, and the horses needed feeding and the ground needed reading, and there was always something that had to be done before anything else could happen. A man can live inside that rhythm for a long time. It's not the worst life. There are men who have had worse and called it good. But there's a thing you give up access to, living that way. A kind of warmth that you can convince yourself you don't miss because you've been without it long enough that you've stopped identifying the cold. And then someone comes through your gate on a November morning with your horse and your granddaughter's horse at her side. No, your horse, just the one, and the cold you've been living in announces itself all at once, and you understand that you've been colder than you knew. But she came. She came back across 14 miles of frozen ground because a stray horse gave her a reason to. And she stayed for all the rest of them. And she worked beside me all day without needing to make it into something. And at the end of it, she put her hand on my arm and said she'd be back. There's a thing a man learns, if he's been paying attention long enough, which is that most of what he expected to have by now, the life he thought he was building toward when he was young and still believed building, was something he knew how to do, comes differently than he expected, or late, or sideways in a form he wouldn't have recognized when he was young enough to recognize things easily. I had stopped expecting this particular thing. Stopped without ceremony. Just let it go the way you let go of a rope when you've been holding it long enough to know the pull isn't coming. But it came. She came. The string was in the corral, all 12. The gray's leg was clean and wrapped and he'd sleep comfortable. There was wood stacked by the door and coffee in the tin, and 2 cups on the shelf. And my daughter was riding home through the dark saying she'd come back, and meaning it. I turned the lamp down and went to bed. I don't know how long I lay there before I slept. Long enough to hear the horses settle further into the night. Long enough to hear the temperature drop another degree or two, the house making small sounds in response. Long enough to think about the weight of a hand on a coat sleeve in the dark, flat and deliberate, pressing to make sure the person is real. She'd come back in a few weeks to check on the gray. I planned on being here. I'd been here. I'd keep being here. And maybe that was the thing about reaching a certain age and a certain kind of life. The value of just staying put, of being in the place where you said you'd be, of still being there when someone who has reason to doubt you comes back through the gate. The gray would be all right. I was going to fix that latch first thing in the morning.